Hey there, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. What has been a very, very cold week for us here in Toronto. Hope everybody's staying warm and staying outdoors, but really appreciate you all joining us on this Thursday. Um, it's a new year. We want to be covering, as we always do in these webinars, sort of what is going on in the world of AI. We've got our CTO and co-founder, Joshua Pantony here, who's going to walk us through a little bit of what happened in 2024 and what he sees for the future of AI in the world of investment management. Thank you very much for joining us, Josh.
Phenomenal. I'm really excited to get into it. Fraser, really quickly, I need you to enable my ability to share my screen.
So sorry about that. Thank you
No
very
problem.
much.
So I'm going to start a little bit by recapping some of the really big things we saw 2023, 2024, where we started to see
Now,
the world
Josh.
shift a little bit. I'm going to talk a lot about some of the use cases and things that we're seeing in the market today, some areas where we've seen some really big productivity gains, some of the shifts we're seeing in user adoption. And then near the end, I'm going to go really far out and start talking about some of the big, deep disruption we see happening as a result of this technology, where I think the world goes over the next few years. And then from there, we're going to open it up to questions. So we'll start with kind of where things have come from. 2023, we talked about it being the year of experimentation. As we got into 2024, I think that's where you went out of experimentation into a lot of adoption. We went from a lot of firms that were just sort of playing with it to starting to get very specific use cases. And you started to see a lot of firms start to adopt it, really at bigger and bigger scales. Move out of like small little research teams and start to get things that had real applications and studying them to real effects. As we shift forward into 2025, we think this year is going to be a year where you see massive acceleration. One of the things that we've seen is we've gone from engagements where we were starting with 5 or 6 users to, in Q4 of last year, our average engagement started as big as 20 people, and we've got some firms that are starting with really big engagements of like 50 plus, with much larger engagements than we've seen historically. And so we're seeing kind of from the market, a lot of folks started dipping their toes in, then started taking bigger bets. And as we're shifting into the year 2025, we think we're going to see a lot of firms start to really accelerate how they think about this and how they start to adopt it. I also think another really big shift is going to be between this idea of systems where you prompt them and get some very basic content back, to systems where you teach them how to do increasingly sophisticated jobs, or increasingly sophisticated workflows, and they do those workflows on your behalf. The word agentic AI is getting thrown around a lot this year. For me, though, it's the ability for a system to do a task that requires a large degree of complexity in a sequence, and automate work that was previously not possible with the first generation of LMs. That's how I think about agentic AI. So I think about systems that can act on your behalf, that can take action without you, that can take very complex action without you, and start to work with you in tasks that you couldn't really do before. And I think that's going to be a very big shift in 2025. That's really going to affect a lot of the world. I think the other thing that's starting to happen is there was, I think, initially some, let's say, resistance in trying to adopt this. I think a lot of firms were very concerned about the regulatory environment, what was acceptable, what was not acceptable. A lot of firms were starting to build up their own internal compliance departments, figure out what they could and couldn't do. And then I also think, as part of that experimentation, a lot of firms started building different initiatives internally. And I think where we started to see kind of towards the end of 2024 is most large firms now have a compliance process in place. They understand what they're looking for. They understand some of the problems. They understand some of the areas of success. And I also think a lot of firms have gotten to the point where they understand more deeply. Here's some things that we can do internally, and then here's some things that are a lot harder to build, and where we maybe it makes sense to start working with other providers. And if you're not at that point, there certainly are still some firms that are kind of still figuring out step one and figuring out what does the compliance look like and how do I think about regulating work like this. But I think across most of the industry, probably I'd say over 60%, most firms now have some kind of internal compliance department, some kind of AI committee, some kind of process. They understand what it is and a pretty good idea of what they want, what they can do and what they can't do, and where there could be some value in some of those gaps. And so as we look forward to 2025, I think that positions most large firms to be in a good spot to really start adopting this at scale. Where before, again, you started with these smaller experiments, we're starting to see more and more firms in 2025 really try to go big across the entire firm. And maybe some high-level comments I'll make on this. As we're starting to do these scales, I think another kind of critical thing we're noticing is as firms get better and better at sort of understanding some of the spaces and gaps and things that can get fed in, having applications that are kind of ready to go, where you say, hey, here's specific automation or here's specific workflow that's value add is very important, very critical. And then trying to build out technology that is auditable, where you can understand exactly where it's coming from, where it's very controllable, and where it sort of scales across a wide variety of use cases continues to be something that's very important. And something I'll just kind of linger on here a little bit as we sort of think through both some of the current capabilities and where we see the world going. As you shifted in the beginning of 2024, there was a lot of AI systems where you could ask it a question. The system could maybe look at a bunch of information, summarize that information, and give you back some kind of response. As we started shifting towards the end of 2024, a lot of firms, ourselves being, I think, one of the more preeminent ones, started building more technology oriented around the idea of, can I take a task, break it into a series of steps, and then start to scale that task. And what I think is going to be really interesting about this year is the kinds of tasks that can be tackled are going to be at a much bigger scale than the kinds of tasks that could be tackled last year. So to sort of call out a few examples of what was possible with the old approach, what's possible now, and then where the world is going. With the first generation of technology, if I ask something like, find companies that had that issued new debt, the first generation might be able to find 5 or 10 examples of companies that match that criteria. And in order to do that, they were basically going out and trying to find 5 or 10 examples of documents or 5 or 10 examples of websites that could showcase some examples of companies that had new debt. But that was rather limited. If you wanted to know every single company in the S&P 500 that was issuing new debt, then it really didn't scale to that. So the next generation of technology, some of the sort of early beginner agentic systems started to get the ability where they could say, okay, no, I'm going to actually scan through and look through everything in the S&P 500. I'm going to go through every 8K, every 4K. I'm going to look through every 10K, every 10Q. From there, I'm going to give you a very complete list of, okay, here's all the companies that have done some kind of new debt issuance in the past little while. And that's where our technology is at right now. As we start thinking forward into the future, though, some of these tasks can start to get very, very complicated. Where, let's say I was trying to analyze the debt book of a company that does construction loans. To be able to really do that, I may want to look at what is every loan the company gave out. Of the loans that the company gave out, how many of those companies are, if the construction's actually finished, how many have not finished? Of the ones that have finished, what's the occupancy rate? Of the ones that have not finished, how many of them have how many units have been pre-sold? And then of the units that have been pre-sold, how confident are we? And then based on that, how much of this company's debt is actually good? Those kind of tasks are quite complex. They require the ability to sort of understand a book of debt at a high level and then create a whole bunch of sub work on top of that. And that's really the kinds of work that's starting to get unlocked this quarter. That ability to do this extremely complex workflows that involves kind of going across a few things. And then as you look forward just a few quarters, you are going to start to see agentic systems that not only can interact with any kind of data and build these complex workflows, but that can actually start to use the computer in the way that that a human would. So you imagine a little AI agent that has access to a keyboard, that has access to a mouse, that can go into a web browser, that can open up the Bloomberg terminal, that can interact with Excel, and now you start to unlock this massive variety of use cases where I can ask it to build me a deck in a particular way. I can ask it to go look up something on the web, look up something else on the terminal, compare and contrast the two things, and then put that into a PowerPoint and produce something I can present to a client. And that's the world we're really going to start to see these systems start to develop into over the next few quarters. So in the short term, we're starting to see a lot of tasks that involves analyzing huge amounts of information and sort of summarizing that. And the ability for the system to handle that in a very complex way is very unprecedented. It's unlocking a huge amount of things. As we look forward just a few quarters, though, you're going to start to see intelligent systems that act more and more and more the same way a human would at their desk. And the amount of things that's going to be able to automate, the amount of work Cygnet's going to be able to achieve is really, I think, quite unprecedented. And so I'll kind of talk through some examples here. I'm maybe going to linger here for a second. I'm going to jump into a quick demo of the platform. I think some of you folks have seen it, some of you haven't. I'll walk through a few different examples of use cases. I'll talk through some different personas. But at a high level, we really see the platform as being able to achieve three different things on behalf of our users. We try to build a system that's really good at automating different kinds of drudgery. So if you have to do something like write an ESG report, or if you have to complete a SWOT analysis, or if you have to write an investment thesis on a company, or if to come up with due diligence questions. These are all examples of things that we want to be able to help with and automate 80 or 90% of the task. We want to be really good at work related to monitoring. So maybe you have a financial model with a bunch of assumptions in that financial model, and you want to know any time that something happens in the world that affects some of your underlying assumptions. We want to be good at trying to automate that and sort of notify when something happens. Let's say you have a portfolio and you want to understand anytime there's like a new and emerging macro risk. Let's say that you have a thesis that Nintendo is going to sell well because it resonates with millennial buyers, and millennials are a big driver of growth in the gaming industry. You could use our system, sort of scan through the world and figure out the second that any of those sentiments start to shift. And then the third kind of power that we really like to engender is what I call superpowers. And this is where it's like a very net new capability. So an example of this would be when the Blackwell chip delay occurred a few months ago. You traditionally look at that by analyzing sell-side reports, by doing channel checks. And you're still going to do that in the new world, but you could use technology like this to scan through 3,000 companies' earnings calls, summarize across all those earnings calls, how many of them are still bullish on working with NVIDIA, and how many of them are looking for alternative providers, and also sort of summarize like what are the kinds of companies that are being positively or negatively affected by this, and that ability to just like analyze 3,000 companies at once and get some conclusions from it. That's something I think a lot of people would have loved to be able to do before, but just fundamentally wasn't possible until you had this kind of technology. And so, from that, there's just a whole variety of different packages of use cases. When we think about earnings, you could use our system to figure out, let's say you're management and you work in an investor relation team. You might use our system to figure out what questions were all my peers asked. And then based on everything my peers were asked, what am I likely going to get asked? You could use it to compare and contrast, the kinds of questions that a given analyst likes to ask across different earnings calls. You could use it when you're coming into a call to analyze everything happening with the company and everything happening with its peers to figure out what questions you should be asking management. You can use it for, if you're, let's say that there are 30 earnings calls in a week that are going to have an impact on you. You're not going to be able to listen to all of them all at once. You could use the system to scan through all the other earnings calls and notify you if anything significant happens that impacts your company, and that should draw your attention. And so kind of across all three of those things, between automating drudgery, monitoring, and superpowers, there's a whole bunch of stuff related to earnings, a whole bunch of stuff related to how you do idea generation, competitor analysis, et cetera. And I'll get into a few examples of agents like this in a minute. I think the other thing that we're really seeing again in the short term is the ability to scan through huge amounts of data and give conclusions in an extremely auditable way is very vital for implementation. That said, I'll maybe jump into a little bit of a demo, showcase different examples of how different folks are using the system, and then from there, I'm going to talk about the future. So for those of you who haven't seen it, this is our dashboard. And the way that we're really trying to set this up, we're trying to build a system that feels a little bit less like an application and a little bit more like a team of AI workers, where I teach these workers how to do some task, and then they're going to do that task on a continuous basis. So I've got one worker here whose job is to basically scan through like 10Ks, 10Qs, maybe 8Ks, press releases, anything from the Chinese government or the American government, and it's going to try to find any company that has some exposure to any S&P 500 company that has any exposure to the Chinese market in some way, shape, or form. I've got another little guy here who's looking at companies in 8Ks and 4Ks and effectively trying to find any company that's made like a new risk disclosure or resolved an old risk disclosure. I've got one here that is constantly scanning through any kind of news with generative AI. Ever since I turned this on, it's been pinging me almost twice a day about some new company raising money. I've got another one over here that's scanning through mid-cap companies, trying to find any company that has made any kind of like new debt issuance or done something non-standard compared to what they did in the past. I've got one here that's looking at like a discounted cash flow analysis I did for Ford, looking at all the basic assumptions I had in my discounted cash flow analysis, analyzing the world, and then sort of proactively telling me if anything in my financial model breaks down or is different than what I'm expecting. And for each of these little workers, I can click into them. This is an example of one that you might use more on the wealth side, actually. So this is an example of an agent where I asked it to go out and find every startup founder over the past few months that has raised some capital. I asked it to tell me how much capital they raised and who the founders were. And I gave it some other criteria as part of that. And so, let's say that you're trying to, let's say you deal primarily with like ultra high net worths, and you're trying to meet with folks that, are going to have a lot of liquidity in the future, but maybe don't have liquidity yet. And you want to start talking with those folks before anyone else does. This can be a great tool, a great way for you to go out and actually find people that are likely going to be ultra high net worth in the future. But which, nobody's talking to today. I'll say for me personally, when I sold my first company, almost 50 different wealth managers reached out after the announcement was released. The one I went with was the person I'd been talking to for months before I actually made the sale happen. So in the wealth space, you could use it as prospecting. You could use it to start thinking about some different folks that you want to target and think about. I've got another agent over here. Again, very, very basic. This is going out and grabbing the 13F of a firm, looking at the holdings of that 13F, and if that firm's holdings change, if they buy a new company or they sell a company, it'll let me know. So this is a way to sort of track maybe different types of activist investors or other things happening in the world. Moving down the complexity a little bit. This is very, very, very basic. You would do something more advanced in real life, but this is an example of an agent I have running whose job is just to basically write like a quick investment summary for AVGO. So you could do things that are 20 pages long. This one's very basic. This is basically just pulling the price, some basic market data for AVGO, summarizing some of the most recent high-level macro themes, summarizing the most recent earnings call, and then generating an investment thesis. So let's say that, again, in a wealth setting, you had to do some kind of compliance for any company that you're buying, or let's say that you wanted to send off a note to a client on why you bought something. This is my internet being slow. You can use this to like really quickly generate a report, and voila, we've probably just automated 1 or 2 hours of this person's life every time they had to write a report like this. This is an example of one more related to idea generation. So this is looking for companies in the NASDAQ with a PE ratio between 10 and 30 that mentioned green shoots in their earnings calls and have had a technology breakthrough in their past year. I'm going to linger on this one a little bit. It's a good example for me to show off some of the differences between an agentic system, such as Alpha, versus more of a traditional system. So one of the things that's very interesting is in an application like ours, the way it handles this query is by basically creating something that we call a work log. So a work log is like a series of steps that the system's going to take in order to achieve some action on behalf of the user. So step 1, this is going to get all the stocks in QQQ. Step 2, it's going to get the PE data for each of those stocks. Step 3, it's going to filter down to the set of stocks, the PE between 10 and 30, etc. And one of the most important things about this is it gives users the ability to sort of audit the machine, to understand exactly what it's doing and double check its work every step of the way. And that auditability, that ability to like really deeply understand what the machine does, it's actually vital in our experience in a lot of financial applications before people can trust it and start actually working with it and using it. I think the second reason that this really matters, though, is because once you can describe exactly how the machine operates, it's much easier for you to actually like download your brain into the machine. This is looking at one definition of green shoots. Maybe it's looking at revitalized business lines, and I really wanted it to look at like new business lines. Maybe green shoots for me actually meant like mean reversion. Like I just wanted the stock price to be going back in the other direction. I don't know. The machine might have interpreted green shoots differently than how I want, because I can audit and exactly see how it did it. It's easier for me to kind of iterate and interact with the machine and get it to where I want it to be. Same kind of thing here. This is looking at 10Ks, 10Qs, CEDAR filings, etc. Maybe I didn't want to do that. Maybe I wanted to look at only sell-side reports. Maybe I wanted to look at sell-side reports from just like this one person. And so once you can kind of see what the machine's doing, it becomes easier for you to teach and train the machine to follow a process that looks exactly like what you do. And then from there, I think the most important significant thing is, with the traditional chat-based system, if I ask this query, it's going to go out and it's going to look at like 4 or 5 articles that try to match this criteria. What's very, very different about this is our system and systems like it are basically trying to analyze the entire space. They're trying to read literally every piece of text. And so in order to achieve this goal, this system read through almost 51 million words in order to answer the question, as opposed to something like ChatGPT that's really going to look at a few thousand words at max. And that's actually really, really significant for a number of reasons. Number one, it's going to give you a much more complete answer. So if you're trying to use this to understand every company in your portfolio that's exposed to China, you really can't use ChatGPT for that, because it's not going to do a holistic analysis, whereas a system like this is going to deeply analyze every one of those companies. If you want to find every company in the world who has a supply chain that runs between Canada and Mexico, if you want to find every company in the world that manufactures a particular type of medical device, if you want to find every company in the world that mentions using NVIDIA chips as part of their technology stack, these are all examples of things that you really need something like this that can handle arbitrarily large amounts of data and arbitrarily large amounts of complexity in order to handle it. And then I think the last reason why this really matters is in order for you to actually build agents that can monitor the world and inform you of interesting information, I actually think this is, at least in finance, vital. I've been playing around a lot with the ChatGPT notification system. And one of the things I notice is a lot of the time the information it sends me is actually not that valuable, because it's just sort of summarizing information from, say, the past 5 or 10 minutes. I think what's very different about an agentic workflow is it has the ability to analyze every piece of context that's happened over the past year. And based on every piece of context from over the past year, understand, okay, what is the delta in information that actually matters? So it can understand, as an example, that, if Bill Gates comes out and tweets, "I love Microsoft," that really isn't significant. I really shouldn't be bothering my PM about the fact that Bill Gates said, "I love Microsoft." If Bill Gates says, I hate Microsoft, or I think Apple is a better company than Microsoft, maybe that does matter. Maybe that is significant because it's a delta in information over what the market knew before. Similarly, if a company announces that they're going to do an M&A deal, and then in 3 days says everything's still looking good, that's probably not very important. But if in 3 days, management has some major disagreement, or there's an investigation, or accusation of insider trading, or some other problem like that emerges, it can understand, hey, this is a new issue. The world didn't know about it before. There's a delta in information here, and this is worthy of sort of bugging a human's attention for. And so it turns out in order to do a really good job of monitoring, you need to actually be able to analyze a huge amount of information and contextualize every new piece of information based on the information that came from before. And so with that said, I'll kind of jump into a few other example use cases. So here's one where I'm basically doing like positional analysis. I'm comparing Wells Fargo to Bank of America. I'm evaluating it across capital positioning, digital banking, regulatory scrutiny. So, maybe I have some thesis that one of these banks is going to be better positioned relative to the SEC, or I have a position that one of them is going to be better positioned in their digital adoption or whatever it is. I can have this system basically constantly scan through the world. And the second someone releases something significant or something happens, it'll notify me. Hey, here's something you should come take a look at. Here's an example of a workflow that involves combining quantitative information with qualitative information. This took the user something like 40 hours to do. So the problem was they wanted to understand every time STX's net income over tangible book value was over 40%. And they wanted to understand what was driving the stock every time it was over 40%. And then what's different about the stock then versus the stock now. And so, to do this in the old world, you would probably go to something like the Bloomberg terminal. You would download every one of these data sets. You would probably hand make the formula yourself. You would then try to, and of course, you've got to make it so that you get it for a quarterly basis or whatever. Then you're going to do a filter. And then after you do a filter, you're going to have to go out yourself. You're going to have to find all the documents you can find for Q4 2019, for 2020 Q2, for 2020 Q4. Then you're going to have to read through those documents yourself, summarize them, compare and contrast. And, somewhere between 15 and 40 hours later, you have your answer to your question. I think what's really powerful with this technology is you get that answer in like 5 minutes. So step one, it's going to go out and it's going to calculate this equation for me. It's going to figure out all the times where it was over 40%. Then it's going to go out, it's going to pull all the documents and information it can find from that quarter. So all the SEC filings, earnings calls, et cetera. It's going to figure out exactly what was going on with the company, summarize it across each of those quarters, and then it's going to compare and contrast what was different about the company from then versus now. And this is an example again of like almost more of that superpower workflow where you're taking something that would take hours and hours and hours before, in this case, more of an exploratory thing, and I'm answering the user question really quickly. This is an example of one where I am basically going out and I am pulling data from the CDC. So this is going to the CDC website. It's grabbing RSV activity levels. It's summarizing what those activity levels look like over time. Then it's summarizing change in those activity levels. And if it sees a spike in activity levels, it's going to email me, text me, notify me in some other way and say, hey, something's happening here, which you've told me you think is significant or important. I've got another example of one here where this is just going through and summarizing macro trends in China once it loads. So this is looking at the CSI 300. This is evaluating across the CSI 300 what are some of the big emerging macro trends. And one of the things I like to show off here is you can see behind the scenes, it's able to like look at huge amounts of Chinese data, and it's also able to analyze that and combine it with massive amount of North American data, right? And for this particular macro trend, it found 129 articles talking about this one issue. And so, I could go on and on. I'd say like the key thing I want to sort of showcase at a high level is this is an example of one that's doing more like table extraction. So this is going to this was one where they're looking at monthly ride-hailing orders and driver's license from the Chinese Ministry of Transportation. So this is going to the Chinese Ministry of Transportation, and it's actually pulling out data from tables in Chinese, which I find to be a really impressive use case. Anyway, so the thing I'm trying to call out across all of these is we're at a world now where if the data exists somewhere and it can be articulated clearly, you can start to build workflows that automate just huge portions of what different types of people do. And I showed some examples here from the wealth world. I showed some examples here from the buy side, a few examples of things that we've seen people do on the sell side. But it's really just a tiny portion of the kinds of automations that can be done. In terms of where I see the world going, I'll talk short term and I'll talk medium term. I think in the absolute short term, one of the biggest problems that we're noticing over and over again is prompt engineering. And I think what's actually really interesting about this is especially when we transition over users that are really used to something like ChatGPT, that can be almost as big as a challenge as when we're transitioning over someone who this is the first time they've ever used any kind of AI product. I think what kind of happens is when you get used to using ChatGPT or systems like that, you unintentionally learn the limitations. You unintentionally learn, like, here's things I can't do in ChatGPT. And so then when you start using a really powerful system that can do use cases you really couldn't get anywhere else, where you can scale to this arbitrary complexity, a lot of sort of early ChatGPT users don't actually even really try out these things in these new, more advanced systems. And so if you're like a ChatGPT user, part of our goal is actually sort of teaching you to break down assumptions and to try things that you're really not used to trying. And then if this is your first time interacting with an AI product, really teaching the art of prompting is right now a really big challenge. In order for these systems, we're used to talking to humans where I might say to Fraser, can you suggest 5 good stock ideas to me, right? We're used to being very terse when we interact with each other. And the reality is humans have a lot of context when they make an ask like that. But AI doesn't really know who you are until you teach it about that, right? So if I say like to an AI system like Alpha, show me 5 good stocks, that really depends on who I am. If I'm a GARP investor, then I'm going to care about a bunch of growth at a reasonable price stocks. If I'm a biotech investor, then maybe I really want it to be finding stocks that have are going to align with a disease vector, or that have medical devices that doctors really like, or a million different variations of that. If I'm someone who does gold mining, then maybe I want it to look at resource statements and summarize which companies can extract gold at a cheaper price than other companies, or whatever it is, right? And so we're used to talking to humans in a terse way, but these systems require you to talk to them in a very deep way, very rich. And in fact, like some of the most powerful users will make these big prompts that are like a paragraph long. And so in the absolute short term, we want to build technology where that problem gets a lot easier. We want to build technology where the system itself is recommending automations it can make on your behalf, and where the system itself is actually able to suggest to you, here's some easier ways to prompt or interact with the system. I think in the medium term, over the next, say, 6 to 9 months, users' tolerance for pain is going to go to effectively zero. I think we're going to need to build systems where you just kind of press a button and it just works. And the way I sort of see that working in this space is by getting technology that just more deeply integrates with how users operate. A lot of people today will interact with each other using things like IB or Slack or other kinds of internal systems. And I'm imagining a world where Alpha is literally just another member of your team. You're sitting there having a conversation, maybe a PM and an analyst, and a CPI report breaks. And traditionally you might say to your analyst, hey, Fraser, do you mind telling me how that CPI report is going to affect our portfolio? And Alpha's right there saying, hey, I think I could run that analysis. I'm going to do it this way, this way, this way. Does that sound like the right way to approach it? And so I think in the medium term, we need to start building systems where they're more deeply integrated, more obviously integrated in workflows, and where they're able to basically suggest on their own ways they can be valuable instead of requiring users to prompt. And then thinking out way far out, which in AI land is like a year or 2 years away. I think there is a once in a generation disruption coming, and I don't know if the market has really started to price this in or think about it. One of the things that me and I think a lot of other people in AI think is very likely to be true is that within the next year or two, there are going to be LLMs that can code as well as 80 to 90% of coders. And I don't think that necessarily means that they replace all coders as an aside. There are things that involve human-to-human interaction in the coding job, which I've gained a greater appreciation for recently, which I think will necessitate coders staying around as a profession for a while. But I do think it makes the cost of producing software exponentially cheaper. And if you start to think about that, in a world where you can reduce the cost of software by like 80 or 90%, then software becomes like the new water. It becomes almost a post-scarcity resource. And that I think has really, really interesting implications. I think one of the high-level comments I'll make on this is a lot of software companies, a lot of SaaS companies, basically have this giant moat because of code they've written in the past. Well, in a world where you can produce code extremely fast and extremely cheap, why do those modes don't really matter anymore? It's really, really easy to kind of like catch up. If I was just to like zoom in on our industry in particular, what we've basically done is we've created a system where you can, through a few prompts, create this custom dashboard where you've given it a backend. The system's going to go through, it's going to pull in a whole bunch of data. It's going to do querying on that data. It's going to pump that data into some front end. And then it's going to do some analysis on the data on a continuous basis. And right now, this is very, very basic, right? These are very basic screens, very basic dashboards where I'm generating different types of tables, I'm generating different types of graphs, and I'm calculating when something has happened to those tables or graphs. But if you start imagining where we're going to be in, say, 2 years, the ability for the LM to generate whatever screen you want on the fly when you want it starts to become more and more common capability. For us in particular, just to call out the big elephant in the room, the Bloomberg terminal has something like 15,000 mnemonics on it. All those mnemonics were hand coded with a specific front end and a specific back end. Well, when you have an LM that can generate exactly what screen a user wants whenever they want it, combined with whatever backend a user wants whenever they want it, then you can generate any function on the terminal as long as you have the data, basically on the fly. And so what does that mean? That means to me, I think, that a lot of traditional software is going to go away. I think a lot of traditional SaaS is going to go away because they're going to be replaced by these systems that are extremely powerful, that can build exactly the UI and interaction that the user wants, exactly when they want it, with exactly the right specifications. And that to me is both a much faster experience, but I also think a much richer experience than traditional SaaS products. So then what happens in its place? Where does the world go? I think that a lot of traditional SaaS products are basically going to get replaced by different types of domain-specific plays. And of course, our mission, our goal is to be the #1 play in finance, but you're starting to see this play out everywhere. You're starting to see groups like Harvey AI in the legal space. You're starting to see some folks doing this in the medical space, and all over the place. I think you're going to increasingly see a world where AI is actually eating traditional software and replacing it with much more powerful systems that can automate more workflows and are much more rich and tailored to what the users want. So with that said, I am going to open things up to questions.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Josh. I think that was a really good sort of narrative of what happened in 2024 and of course what's going to happen in the next year and then the years forward. I think one of the things that jumped out to me is the sort of breadth of knowledge and sort of capability that AI has bestowed upon people. But in that, I think there's also a difficulty in sort of this like, I guess I would call it blank page syndrome, right? Where it's like it can do anything you want. How do you think about, the things that you want it to do? So I don't know if there's anything you want to kind of cover around
Yep.
helping folks kind of narrow it down there.
Yeah, I think this is probably one of the biggest challenges that has to be solved for AI adoption, not just for us, but really for the whole world. There's the challenge of like, how do I use it in step one? But then the other challenge is, these systems are moving at exponential speeds. And so the set of things they can do tomorrow is going to be bigger than the set of things they could do yesterday. And keeping up with that is very, very difficult. The way we've tackled it and the way we think about it is really by trying to build out an internal team that is really, really good at training and teaching. In fact, when you first start onboarding with us, we're initiating this thing we call Boosted University, where basically we've got a full course that we're trying to teach on prompt engineering, on what the system can do, what systems like this can't do. And, really, we try to sit down with each of our users for an hour at a time, 30 minutes to an hour at a time, really learning about their workflows, learning what they do on a day-to-day basis, and then basically suggesting to them, okay, here's places we can save you time, and here's places where we can be value add. And the comment I like to say is, what we really want to do, our perfect user is someone who has some tasks they really don't like doing. Because that's where we want to start. We want to start with the tasks that are just really painful, really brutal, that nobody wants to do. Nobody likes reading through 8Ks. I have yet to meet a single human being who's just, loves waking up in the morning and reading through every 8K in their portfolio. Some people like writing investment thesis reports. Some people really don't. Some people like building financial models. Some people really don't. There's all kinds of examples of different things and automations that we can build for users. But it really starts with what do you not want to do? And then we're going to build on top of that. And sort of teach and guide people how to prompt the system to get it to do the kind of tasks they would need it to do.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think it's about, approaching for, hey, what does your day-to-day look like? How can, we make it easier for you? I think it's about simplifying people's work so they can do more with, ideally less. Um, so thanks for that, Josh. I want to run through, first of all, thank you everybody who's attended for throwing a lot of great questions in here. One of the ones I want to start off with, because I think this kind of speaks to uh, the scalability and more of an enterprise sort of level approach would be somebody's asked, I'd love to learn how AI agents are helping reduce product manufacturing cycles in asset management. I think, launching new things, et cetera. If you could speak to that.
Yeah, for sure. So there's a bunch of different components to that. I sort of see it in maybe two or three different elements. So there's constructing the product in the first place. Then there's the actual approval process of the product, and then there's the distribution of the product. And depending on which part of that pipeline you're thinking about, we can be valuable in different ways. So for the first element of constructing the product, you can use our system in really advanced ways to build out different types of portfolios. So you might use our system. There's a company called Evolve that launched one of the first generative AI ETFs in Canada, powered by Boosted technology. And the way that works behind the scenes is we're basically scanning through every piece of text we can find for every company in the R1K and the TSX 60. And we're trying to find any company that seems like it could benefit from generative AI, either directly or through the supply chain. So it might find a company that has really unique data sets, or it might find a company that does cooling systems for data centers, or it might find a company that have lenses that do really well in a robotics context for like human vision. So basically, this particular one's first job is like, I'm going to find every company in the world that could potentially benefit generative AI. And it's specifically trying to find both the obvious ones and the sort of like diamonds in the rough that other people aren't aware of or haven't really covered. So that's a really advanced one, but you could also use it for doing things like more classic quant, where I want to get something that's basically like the S&P 500, but I want to have like 15 basis points of tracking error. I'm going to go a little bit more overweight in things where there's some positive news. And I'm going to do like a beta smart or beta plus plus kind of strategy. You could do something like launch a water scarcity ETF. You could use it to implement a tax optimization strategy. You could use it in more of like an SMA category context where you're trying to build out these custom systems. So there's a whole bunch of things around product construction, product ideation, figuring out what kinds of our ideas for ETFs that might sell with a particular demographic. What are people interested in? and then actually implementing those ideas and building ETFs. And then on the distribution side, you can build out different kinds of agents to help with things like marketing, also to help with things like analyzing what are different types of analysts that are, this is more likely to resonate with. Looking at things, potentially like Fintrix and other data sets and really trying to go through and do like a deep dive analysis, like really figure out like, all right, where should I be spending my time selling this or focusing or drawing attention to? What kinds of marketing materials should I bring? And then actually generating those kinds of marketing materials. So I just did a bunch of things at a very high level. This is something that sounds interesting. Would love to have more detailed conversations, but basically, when you think about bringing a new product to market, there's a bunch of different things that are involved in that, and we build out different automations for different elements of that journey.
Very cool. Thanks for that, Josh. So, the thing that we see basically every time we do webinars and people just sort of asking a broad question that I would categorize as how are other people that look like me using it? So this question is sort of where do you see clients that are seeing the most success with it, agentic AI, and what does that signal for the future to you?
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting question. To be honest, there's a lot of different workflows. There's some really common ones that you see all over the place, like due diligence questions. I think almost everyone who's an analyst, buy side or sell side, is interested in using it to make sure that they're asking the deepest possible questions so that they haven't missed anything. Or, on the flip side, if you are management, actually using it to think about the kinds of questions you're going to get asked. So there's some, if you're an IR team, there's some similarity there. But I think outside of that, it can be really, really distinct depending on the per user. There's some broad things. There's a lot of people who have different tasks related to web scraping. So there's a lot of folks where it's like, I don't know, I want you to go through this company, look at all the competitors' websites, and tell me anytime that they launch a competing product. Or I want you to go to the Air Jordan's website, and I want you to look at every Air Jordan's product, and I want you to summarize the average price of that product and compare the average price of an Air Jordan's product, from now over the past 6 years, and tell me anytime that there's been a change in price for that. Or I want you to go to every company's investors relations website, scrape the investors presentations and determine when something new or significant happens. So there's a bunch of stuff related to where people are basically like going to government websites or going to individual websites, and they're currently like manually downloading the data, putting the data into internal spreadsheets or internal PowerPoints, and then just sort of like monitoring the world. So there's a lot of like monotonous monitoring like that we can basically almost 100% automate. In most cases, 100% automate. There's a bunch of use cases related to doing like just research, like there's this emerging issue, and I want you to find every company that touches on this emerging issue, or I want you to look at semiconductors. I want you to look at everything, up the supply chain with semiconductors, down the supply chain with semiconductors, and figure out some big disruptions that could be occurring. There's basic things like I'm trying to build a financial model. Let's evaluate the financial model together. Let's look through all the basic assumptions, make sure the assumptions are correct, find any information that could affect those assumptions, vice versa. Yeah, I mean, I could go on and on. I'd say basically what people want us to automate, and the tasks that we automate are very distinct and can be, user to user. But the sort of high level way to think about it again is what I said at the very beginning, which is automate drudgery, monitor the world, superpowers. So in terms of like automate drudgery, is there a thing that you do on a repeated basis? Like every time an earnings call comes out, are you more or less looking for the same information? Are you more or less trying to write the same report? Every time a 10Q comes out or 10K comes out, are you more or less trying to write the same information? If it's something where there's some repeatability in your task, we can probably automate it, or at least automate a bunch of it. Are there situations where you have to react to the world, where there's some big information or some big thing happening, and you need to take some action after that thing happens? We can probably build an automation to help you monitor the world and tell you when something happens that matters. And then in terms of superpowers, the way I think about it is like, is there some deep burning question that you really want answered and you're having a hard time getting answered, or that it's going to take you a huge amount of work to get answered? We can probably help build an agent to help with that. Those are the kind of like broad level, and then the specifics are very, very idiosyncratic and user dependent.
No, that's a great way, I think, of thinking about it. Just kind of thinking about your day, thinking about, your team's day, thinking about uh, your organization's day, and sort of, yeah, how can you automate different parts of it? And, yeah, drudgery, superpowers, and of course, monitoring. So we're coming up towards the end here, so I think I'll leave time for maybe one or two more questions. But thanks again, everybody, for running with this. This question, which I think is a good one, is how we're targeting a lot of segments here. We're hitting a lot of segments. How is wealth management using agentic AI versus sort of like capital markets type teams and then like asset management type teams? Is there any big distinctions you're seeing between those sorts of
Between, sorry,
users
wealth management and
and more asset management style users?
yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting is wealth management. You can really kind of like segment it. So I mean, there's the wirehouses, and then there's the more independent folks. There's firms that operate more like a family office, and then firms that are, starting out a little bit more, and kind of like depending on where you are, your use cases will be a little bit different. Um, so some of the really clever use cases I've seen is people using it as like a bit of a prospecting tool. Showed an example of that at the beginning where it's like going out, looking through LinkedIn and looking through news, looking through LinkedIn and trying to find startup founders who have raised a little bit of money but aren't well known yet. Um, there's examples of trying to use it to generate marketing material. There's examples of using it to actually, some of the bigger groups will actually trade their own stocks. And so for them, it looks a little bit more like some of the buy side use cases where we're helping with idea generation, we're helping with portfolio construction, we're helping with tax optimization strategies, things like that. And we're actually helping with, both finding things to buy and finding things to sell, and composition. There's a lot of client communication. That's a really, really common one. A lot of folks have to do market commentary, or they have to give some kind of assessment of what's happening, or if they have to reach out to people and try to find, good touch points. So again, depending on the type of firm, there can be differences, but anything from like prospecting to helping manage the book itself to helping you communicate with your clients are probably the most common things that we see in wealth. On the buy side, again, just dozens and dozens of use cases, right? Anything from going back to the big three things, going back to automate drudgery, monitor and superpowers, right? So if you have to write ESG reports, you have to write investment thesis, if you have to do due diligence calls, if you have to do channel checks, if you have to build out financial models, et cetera, et cetera. There's a ton of things in that area that we can help automate, and save you time on. On the second element of monitoring the world, tons of information you might want to get informed about. And then, help answer different types of research questions. So high level, there's a little bit of overlap with some of the biggest investment management firms. And then, probably prospecting and client communication are the two things that are most distinct to wealth versus other groups.
I know that you mentioned buy side, but I think that folks on the sell side also are able to use this technology. Can you speak a little bit to how those folks are using it?
Yeah, a lot of similarity. Just the amount of depth that you might go into on the sell side will sometimes differ. There are some buy side folks that also will have analysts that cover 5 or 10 stocks. So there are some buy side and sell side cases that are actually quite similar. But there's a lot of variety. There might be there's, I guess I'll go through some things that are like really, really distinct. So there's some like investment banking groups that do like management consultancy where they're using it to basically help coach management, where they're basically like simulating different types of questions that might get asked, predicting areas that might be of concern, and basically doing competitive analysis and basically using it to help build out different pieces of context. You might have folks more on the like junior bankers that might use it for helping them build presentations and things like that. You might actually use it to help build out and write different types of research reports or do analysis on things. You might use it to look at more broad trends. There are a lot of sell-side use cases that involve pulling data from different types of public sources, actually. I think that there's a use case I talked about earlier where someone was trying to assess a company that gave out a lot of construction loans. and they wanted to know like, okay, how many of the construction loans are actually in a good spot and how many are bad. I think that was more of a sell side use case. So they were basically like going through looking at every 8K, 4K, 10K over the company's 10-year history, every earnings call, and trying to figure out like, all right, what is every construction loan this company made? Figuring out here's a list of all the construction loans they made, and then going out and analyzing like every one of those construction loans. Have the, what's the status of the project? Has it launched? How many units are pre-sold? How many units are not pre-sold? And then from there, basically assessing like, all right, how much of this debt book is like in a good spot and how much is in a bad spot. So yeah, went into it like a really micro example there, but again, just back to that original point, drudgery, monitoring superpowers. There's some commonality between the buy and the sell side there. And then there tends to be, I think, just maybe a little bit more specificness in the kind of work that you're doing on the sell side.
Thank you so much, Josh. I do see there's a bunch of questions in the chat here,
Yeah,
but we're
I'll
kind of
maybe try to
running out
just
of.
do like rapid fire, if that's okay, Fraser. Sorry to
Of
destroy your
course, I
flow a
just
little
wanted
bit.
to also let the folks know that we'll reach out to them after this to answer any questions that were not answered here. But sure, Josh, if you want to do that, we've got 4 minutes
Is
left. So
is Alpha scraping corporate websites? Yes, you can get Alpha to scrape corporate websites. Although again, it runs into a little bit of a prompt challenge depending on what you're looking to do. But yes, it is something you can do. How does Alpha handle paywalls for information? We pay an absurd amount of money to get a massive amount of data. We have something like 150,000 news wires, sorry, not sell side, 150,000 news wires, trade publications. We work with S&P. I think we work with Refinitiv. We work with a whole bunch of other providers. So there's a massive amount of data that we pay for that's in our system. And then, of course, we're able to scrape public sources as well. If your compliance department allows us to, if your compliance department does not allow us to, then we will not scrape. Can you make the
I think a
case?
lot of these other ones are much longer and probably more conversational. So
Yeah, I'll
they're great
maybe.
questions.
Yeah, most common use. Okay, I already kind of addressed that. Technical trading indicator. Yes, you can apply a couple technical trading indicators to a stock. Totally. I don't have time to show that use case, but I've got a bunch that are kind of like that. Salesforce has bet its future building agentic layer to leverage its software. Is Boosted working with SaaS companies like CRM and data providers like Broadridge, Bloomberg, LSE, S&P Global to improve performance? So first of all, yes, we do work with providers like S&P Global. They're probably one of our biggest providers that we work with. We have all of Capital IQ ingested in our system as an example and a bunch of other data sets. I will say, though, I think the way that I think about agentic systems is a little bit different than how Salesforce thinks about agentic systems. I think a lot of what Salesforce is doing, with digital labor, I have a lot of respect for it as an aside, but I think a lot of what they're trying to think about is creating these systems that can have back and forth conversations with users. And I think a lot of it is in the sort of like customer support layer. And that's a very valuable problem to focus on, but it's a little bit different than what we're talking about. Ultimately, the Salesforce paradigm still requires some kind of chat and interaction, whereas a lot of what we're building is like you're getting it to do work on a repeated basis. So I want it to, every time there's an earnings call, summarize if it affects any risk in my portfolio and notify me of any companies that could be impacted by that earnings call, right? That's an example of something you might build in our system. Or look through literally every SEC filing for every company in the S&P 500, look through every government release from China and America, look through the news, and tell me the second that there's a change in any company's exposure to China, right? These are examples of tasks that we could do where it's basically doing work on a continuous basis, whereas the Salesforce version of agents is really like these the very domain-specific chatbots that help with customer service. Both are very valuable. It does kind of point to what I was saying originally, though, that the word agentic is going to get very overloaded this year and confusing. So for us, agents mean something that can do work offline without talking to you.
Well,
Cool.
so I think that's a great point to call it. I think I want to thank everybody for joining and for asking such great questions. Just to reiterate, agentic AI is going to be bigger than ever this year. To Josh's point, it might get oversaturated, but think always about like, can you automate your drudgery? Can you monitor things that you want to be sort of watching the world for? And can you give yourself superpowers? I think would be the big things. Josh, I don't know if you have any closing out words, but
No, thank you guys all very much for the attention. I'm ridiculously excited. I know it's been a wild ride to date, but legitimately the technology that's going to be coming out over the next 3 to 9 months is going to be earth-shaking even compared to what came out before. And the next few years are going to be, I think, some of the most transformative years of my life. So I'm really, really excited. Thank you guys all so much for joining us. And we look forward to the time ahead.
Thank you all. Have a nice day.